Hello, my friends and fellow guardians of the Republic. I want to thank you again for being part of this journey, not just to learn about the Constitution, but to learn how to defend it, apply it, and most importantly, how to enforce it. But before we do this, we've got to remember what the garden looked like at the beginning. We need to remind ourselves not only what the Constitution says, but why it says it, and how nullification was built into our system as the peaceful and lawful way to stop federal tyranny. Let's start with a truth that ought to be obvious, but tragically isn't anymore. Not in classrooms, not in courtrooms, and certainly not in the halls of Congress. In this country, the United States of America, we believe, or at least we're supposed to believe, that rights come from God, not from government. That isn't just a poetic phrase from a dusty old document. That's the bedrock principle of the American idea. You don't get your rights from a president. You don't get them from Congress. You don't get them from the courts or from any other institution of man. They don't hand down liberty like favors from a throne. You are born with them. Your rights were breathed into your soul by your Creator, not conferred by any legislature or decree. That's what the founders meant when they declared in 1776 that all men are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, rights that no king, no parliament, no judge, and no bureaucrat has the power to give or take away. But let's be clear, those rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, aren't licenses for lawlessness. They don't give us permission to do whatever we want, whenever we want, with no regard for others. That's not liberty, that's chaos. And chaos is the doorway to tyranny. That's why the Apostle Paul wrote, "All things are lawful unto me, but all things are not expedient." In other words, just because you can doesn't mean you should. Real liberty, the kind the founders fought and died for, isn't a free-for-all. It's not about unbridled appetite or reckless abandon. It's about self-government. It's about choosing to do what's right, not because you're forced to, but because you're free to. That's what we call ordered liberty. And that, my friends, is the true foundation of Americanism. You see, when the founders talked about liberty, they weren't talking about anarchy, where each man is a law unto himself. And they certainly weren't talking about mob rule, where rights are voted away by majority whim. They were talking about a system of liberty rooted in something higher, in the eternal, unchanging truths of natural law given by God Himself. Natural law tells us that there's a difference between right and wrong, between justice and injustice. And that truth exists whether government recognizes it or not. Human law, the kind written down in constitutions and statutes, is only legitimate when it reflects and respects natural law. That's why government exists, not to bestow rights, but to secure them. That's the exact language used in the Declaration of Independence, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. Government's purpose isn't to control you, monitor you, tax you into submission, or regulate your life down to the size of your soda. Government exists for one reason, and one reason only: to protect the rights you already have from God. Now, here's the tension, the balance that makes a constitutional republic possible. You are free. But your freedom stops where someone else's begins. You have the right to swing your fist, but not hit your neighbor's nose. You have the right to speak freely, but not to silence someone else's speech with violence. That careful boundary, that moral restraint, that's the difference between a republic and a riot. Because without virtue, freedom becomes a weapon. Without truth, democracy becomes a mob. And without law grounded in God's law, government becomes a god unto itself. The founders knew this. That's why they tethered liberty to virtue and government to law. They understood that a free people must be a moral people, or their freedom won't last a generation. So let's not confuse liberty with libertinism. Let's not confuse freedom with foolishness. And let's never forget the truth that formed this nation. Rights come from God. Government exists to protect them, and liberty lives only where virtue rules. Now, here's a point that gets overlooked far too often, even by those who proudly carry the Constitution in their pocket. The Constitution doesn't just limit the federal government. It limits every level of government, federal, state, and local. Let me say that again slowly and clearly. Every state in this union is bound by the Constitution of the United States. And that includes every agency, every department, every bureaucrat, and every politician operating under its authority. This wasn't accidental. This was intentional. The framers didn't fight a war for liberty just to let states invent their own brands of tyranny under the banner of home rule or local control. Article 4, Section 4 of the Constitution guarantees that every state shall have a republican form of government. That means the people of each state are guaranteed the protection of a republic, not a democracy, not a monarchy, not mob rule, and certainly not the kind of regulatory dictatorship we see being run today by unelected commissions and alphabet soup agencies. So what is a republic in the American tradition? It's a system where the rule of law is supreme, where individual rights are secure, and where power is spread out, limited, and kept in check, not concentrated in the hands of the few. A republic is not government by opinion polls. It's not government by emergency orders. It's not do whatever the majority wants. It is government under law, not under the moods and movements of the moment. And here's where it gets critical. States don't get a pass just because they're smaller or closer to home. They don't get to create their own unconstitutional systems and call it local control. Just because oppression is happening in your state capital instead of in Washington, D.C., doesn't make it lawful. Constitutional violations don't get excused by geography. Let's be clear. State governments do not have the authority to violate your God-given rights, no more than the federal government does. The Bill of Rights was not written only for Washington to obey. It was written to restrain government, period. You see, in a republic, no government at any level gets to nullify your right to speak freely, to worship God, to defend your family, or to live in liberty, not even by popular vote. Too often we hear excuses like, well, that's just how we do things in this state, or our local officials voted for it, so it's legitimate. No, it's not. And that's why state nullification, as powerful as it is, must never become a free-for-all. It must be grounded in truth, constitutional truth. If we start nullifying everything we don't like, even if it's constitutional, then we've traded law for lawlessness. But if a federal law violates the Constitution, a state not only has the right to nullify it, it has the duty to do so. On the flip side, if a state passes a law that violates your God-given rights, whether that's your right to bear arms, to educate your children, to speak freely, or to worship as your conscience dictates, then you have every right to defy that law and to call upon your local leaders to interpose. So whether the threat comes wrapped in red tape from Washington or wrapped in rhetoric from your own governor's office, we must hold the line. Because in this republic, in this constitutional republic, no one is above the law. And the highest law in this land is not the executive order, not the state mandate, and not the will of a temporary majority. It is the Constitution of the United States, written in ink, defended in blood, and still binding today. Remember this: if it's unconstitutional, it's illegitimate. If it violates your God-given rights, it's void. And if it comes from Washington, Nashville, Sacramento, or even your own city council, it makes no difference. No government at any level has the rightful authority to trample on liberty. Not then, not now, not ever. Let's get right down to it. No fluff, no delay, just the truth on the table. The federal government has only those powers that are enumerated in the Constitution. Not implied, not assumed, not vaguely suggested. Enumerated. That means specifically listed, like items on a grocery receipt or rounds in a magazine. You know exactly what's there, and by extension, you know exactly what's not. The founders didn't say, here's a blank slate, fill in the rest as you go. No, sir. They weren't fools. They had just fought a war against a king who believed in undefined power. They knew that unchecked authority always leads to unchecked tyranny. So what did they do? They sat down, and with the clarity of statesmen and the precision of men who understood the gravity of every word they wrote, they spelled it out. They gave the federal government a specific job description, laid down in ink and ratified by the people. And by listing what the federal government could do, they were doing something even more powerful. They were excluding everything else. That's how the law works. That's how contracts work. And that's how the Constitution works. Although it is forgotten now, James Madison, as a congressman, delivered a famous speech in 1792 where he eloquently explained the effect of a broad and unbounded definition of general welfare. If Congress can apply money indefinitely to the general welfare and are the sole and supreme judges of the general welfare, they may take the care of religion into their own hands. They may establish teachers in every state, county, and parish and pay them out of the public treasury. They may take into their own hands the education of children. In short, everything from the highest object of state legislation down to the most minute object of police would be thrown under the power of Congress. And that's not a poetic observation, it's a legal boundary. Madison understood that once you allow government to operate on vague intentions instead of strict delegation, you've just stepped off the firm foundation of a republic and into the quicksand of soft despotism. Let me give you a simple analogy. If you give your teenage son a list of chores while you're out of town, take out the trash, mow the lawn, feed the dog, and you come back to find that he's bulldozed the garage and built a go-kart track, you don't shrug and say, well, I didn't forbid that. No, you point to the list. You say, this is what I told you to do. This is what you were authorized to do. The rest, that's on you, and it's out of bounds. That's exactly how Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution works. It's not a suggestion. It's not a summary. It is the federal job description, signed off by the states and binding on every branch, every agency, and every official operating under the authority of the Constitution. It lists exactly what Congress is allowed to do, and by doing so, it also makes crystal clear what it's not allowed to do. If a power isn't on that list, Congress doesn't have it, period. Full stop. No fine print, no creative interpretation, no bureaucratic workaround. Now here's where it gets serious. If Congress simply obeyed that one rule, the rule of enumerated powers only, we wouldn't just see a few budget cuts or policy changes. we'd see the entire bloated monstrosity of the federal government collapse like a house of cards. We'd wave goodbye to entire federal departments, education, energy, labor, health and human services, and dozens of others that operate entirely outside the framework of constitutional authority. They exist today not because they're lawful, but because Congress abandoned its oath and started legislating beyond the limits of the list. And here's the kicker: they know it. Don't let well-meaning ignorance be an excuse. Sure, some members of Congress are just uninformed. They've never been taught the Constitution as it was intended. They rely on staffers and legal advisors and political consultants who've never read the Federalist Papers, much less Sidney or Blackstone. But others, they know exactly what they're doing. They've read the Constitution, they've taken the oath, and they've made a conscious decision to ignore it, to expand their power, grow the federal Leviathan, and leave the American people buried under laws, regulations, taxes, and mandates that were never authorized in the first place. That's not confusion. That's not incompetence. That's corruption. And it's up to us, we the people, to call it out, to expose it, and to resist it. It's up to us to pull out that pocket constitution, point to the list in Article 1, Section 8, and say, if it's not in here, you can't do it. That one principle, enumerated powers only, is the key to restoring the republic, reining in the federal monster, and returning government to its rightful place, chained down by the Constitution and answerable to the people. Now that we've begun to see that the federal government's power was meant to be very limited, and that the limit of that authority is found in the enumerated powers of the U.S. Constitution, let's ask the question that every liberty-loving American must be ready to answer. In other words, what do you do when a so-called law violates the Constitution? You do what our founding fathers did to the Stamp Act and to all the other acts of the British government that violated their rights under the English Constitution. You nullify. Nullification is not rebellion. It's not lawlessness. It's not chaos. It's not civil war. It's a peaceful, lawful, and constitutional stand in defense of the highest law in the land. Let's define it clearly. Nullification is the refusal to comply with a government act that violates the Constitution. It's the people or their local and state representatives saying, that law is void, that regulation is illegitimate, that order has no authority here. Nullification is not about what's popular, it's about what's constitutional. Now, closely related to nullification is a principle called interposition, and this one is powerful. Interposition happens when a lower civil authority, like a sheriff, a mayor, a state legislature, or even a governor, steps between the people and a lawless higher authority. That's what a sheriff does when he refuses to enforce federal gun laws that violate the Second Amendment. That's what a state does when it passes a law saying, we will not comply with this unconstitutional federal mandate. It's the lawful authority standing up, planting its feet, and saying to Washington, not here, not now, not ever. Let me be very clear on this point. Nullification and interposition are not just theoretical concepts. They're not fringe ideas. They're not relics of the 18th century. They are active duties that belong to every level of government and to every citizen. And here's the part the establishment doesn't want you to hear. Anyone can nullify. States can nullify. Cities and counties can nullify. Sheriffs can nullify. And individuals, you and me, can nullify. Every time you refuse to comply with an unconstitutional law, you are practicing nullification. Every time you say, no, I don't need a permit to carry a weapon, The Second Amendment already guarantees me the right to bear arms. You are engaging in personal, peaceful, principled nullification. And let's be blunt. You don't need the government's permission to exercise a right it was never authorized to regulate in the first place. If the Constitution doesn't delegate a power to the federal government, they don't have it. And if they don't have it, you don't need to ask them before you exercise your liberty. Let me repeat that for the folks in the back. If the Constitution doesn't authorize it, the government can't regulate it, and you don't need a permission slip to ignore it. That's not radical. That's not rebellious. That's American. And the founders knew exactly what they were doing. They didn't create a system where the people would have to sit silently while the federal government became the judge, jury, and executioner of its own power. They gave us the tools to fight back without firing a shot. Nullification is one of those tools. Interposition is another. And the Constitution is the sword we wield in both hands. Now, one thing we do run into from time to time, especially in our circles of liberty-minded folks, is the temptation toward what I call unconstitutional nullification. And we've got to be honest and vigilant about this, because as defenders of the Constitution, we can't just nullify whatever we don't like. That's not principle, that's anarchy. Unconstitutional nullification usually crops up when someone gets fed up, rightfully so, with federal overreach or state-level tyranny. They hit a boiling point, and then they decide to nullify something simply because it offends them without giving any serious consideration to whether that law or policy actually violates the U.S. Constitution or their state constitution. Let me give you a historical example that helps illustrate this clearly. Back in 1832 and 1833, John C. Calhoun, who had served as vice president under both John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson, pushed hard for South Carolina to nullify a federal trade tariff. Now, that tariff really was causing severe economic harm to the agricultural economy of South Carolina. No question about it. It was crushing them. So let's walk this through. Was the trade tariff an extremely harmful, unfair burden on South Carolina? Yes. Was the trade tariff constitutional? Yes. So here's the key question. Was it constitutional for South Carolina to nullify that tariff? No. See, just because something is bad policy doesn't mean it's unconstitutional. And nullification isn't about whether we like the law. It's about whether the law violates the Constitution. Fortunately, cooler heads eventually prevailed. The crisis was negotiated peacefully. Congress had even passed a bill authorizing the president to use military force against South Carolina if necessary. But thankfully, war was avoided. Still, the moment stands as a lesson for us today. Nullification must be used lawfully and constitutionally, or it loses its power and credibility. That's why it's absolutely vital that we understand and teach the difference between constitutional and unconstitutional nullification. Nullification may only lawfully be used to prohibit the implementation or enforcement of something that clearly violates the Constitution. So let's pause and get back to the basics. What exactly is nullification? Nullification is the act of refusing to recognize or comply with an unconstitutional act of the federal government. That's it. That's the definition. That is why it is so crucial, now more than ever, that we study the Constitution, that we know what it actually says, and that we understand the process by which it was written, debated, and ratified. Let's never forget this. The states created the federal government, not the other way around. The states are the sovereign parties to the constitutional compact. The federal government is their agent, their employee, not their master. And when that employee steps outside the job description, it's not just the right, but the duty of the states and the people to rein it in. Now let me address a claim that you're almost guaranteed to hear if you talk about nullification in any public setting. Didn't nullification get used to protect slavery? That's what opponents will argue, often with smug certainty. And they couldn't be more wrong. In fact, it's exactly the opposite. Nullification was used to fight slavery, to resist the immoral enforcement of federal slave-catching laws in states where slavery had already been rejected by the people. Let's look at the facts. On September 18, 1850, Congress passed one of the most despicable laws in American history, the Fugitive Slave Act. This federal law required that escaped slaves had to be returned to their owners, even if those slaves had made it to a free state where slavery was outlawed. Let that sink in. The federal government was forcing free states to act as agents of Southern slaveholders. It was compelling them to participate in human bondage, and it did so without granting those accused any due process. No jury, no trial, no defense, just chains. This wasn't just unconstitutional, it was morally reprehensible, and Wisconsin stood up. Joshua Glover, a man enslaved in Missouri, escaped and made his way north through Illinois and into Wisconsin en route to freedom in Canada. But before he could cross the border, he was arrested under the authority of the Fugitive Slave Act and thrown into the Milwaukee County Jail. Now here's where things get heroic. A Wisconsin abolitionist by the name of Sherman Booth caught wind of what had happened. Booth was a journalist and a man of conscience. He didn't grab a musket or take to the streets with violence. He used the power of the press and the pulpit. He published editorials. He gave speeches. He rallied his fellow Wisconsinites to stand for justice and to oppose the enforcement of an unconstitutional and immoral federal law. And the people responded. Booth's words stirred the hearts of freedom-loving citizens. They broke into the jail. They freed Joshua Glover. They got him onto a boat, and from there he escaped to freedom in Canada. Now let's be clear. Booth himself did not physically participate in the jailbreak, but that didn't matter to the federal government. They came for him anyway. Booth was arrested and prosecuted under the Fugitive Slave Act for aiding and abetting Glover's escape. But this is where things get even more important. Booth's attorney filed a petition for a writ of habeas corpus in Wisconsin State Court, arguing that U.S. Marshal Stephen Abelman had unlawfully and unconstitutionally imprisoned Booth within the sovereign borders of Wisconsin. Now, what did the Wisconsin Supreme Court do? In 1854, the court unanimously ruled in Booth's favor. They granted the writ of habeas corpus and declared the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 null and void because it unconstitutionally federalized slave catching. Read that again. The Wisconsin Supreme Court nullified an unconstitutional act of Congress. This wasn't fringe theory. This was a state judiciary using its rightful authority to protect the liberty of its citizens from federal tyranny. But of course, Washington wouldn't let it stand. On March 7, 1859, the case made its way to the U.S. Supreme Court in Abelman versus Booth. The court overturned the Wisconsin ruling. They declared that federal courts have the final say in constitutional matters and that states have no authority to nullify federal laws or federal court decisions. Now here's the part that every American should know, but very few are ever taught. Wisconsin refused to bow down. The people of Wisconsin through their elected representatives, stood their ground. On March 19, 1859, the Wisconsin legislature passed Joint Resolution Number 4. And this wasn't some mild protest. This was a full-throated constitutional rebuke of judicial tyranny. Listen to what they said. Resolved, the Senate concurring, that we regard the action of the Supreme Court of the United States in assuming jurisdiction in the case before mentioned as an arbitrary act of power unauthorized by the Constitution and virtually superseding the benefit of the writ of habeas corpus and prostrating the rights and liberties of the people at the foot of unlimited power. They didn't mince words. They didn't negotiate with tyranny. And they continued. Resolved that this assumption of jurisdiction by the federal judiciary in the said case, and without process, is an act of undelegated power and therefore without authority, void, and of no force. And here's the crown jewel of that resolution, a line that should be memorized by every patriot in this country. Resolved that the government formed by the Constitution of the United States was not made the exclusive or final judge of the extent of the powers delegated to itself, but that, as in all other cases of compact, such as the U.S. Constitution, among parties having no common judge, each party has an equal right to judge for itself, as well of infractions as of the mode and measure of redress. That right there is the heart of federalism. That's the doctrine of state sovereignty. That's the moral and constitutional justification for nullification. So, just as the Wisconsin Supreme Court nullified the Fugitive Slave Act in 1854, the Wisconsin legislature nullified the U.S. Supreme Court's decision in 1859. And guess what? The federal government, despite all its saber rattling, backed down. Shortly before leaving office in 1861, President James Buchanan officially pardoned Sherman Booth. Let that sink in. A federal law intended to preserve slavery was stopped by nullification. And it wasn't nullified to defend oppression. It was nullified to defy it. So the next time someone tries to paint nullification as a tool of racists or traitors, you remind them of Wisconsin, the state that stood up, defied Washington, rescued a man from bondage, and made nullification a weapon of liberty. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the power of nullification. And this is how nullification stopped the enforcement of unconstitutional federal slave-catching laws in a free state. Nullification didn't preserve slavery, it helped to end it. Now that we've unpacked interposition and nullification, seen them in action, and reviewed how the Constitution grants only limited powers to the federal government, let's take the next step. It's time to look at what the Constitution says on a wide range of subjects, ranging from war powers to trade. But first, we'll shine a bright light on constitutional money. Until then, stay vigilant, virtuous, and valiant, my friends.